The supermarket aisles were a second home to Margaret, a place where her weeks unfolded with mechanical precision. Mondays were for fresh produce, Thursdays for pantry essentials, and Sundays a treat of freshly baked bread. Life had settled into this rhythm, a predictable pattern that offered solace but little excitement. Margaret was a woman of 52, with a life that felt as though it had gently narrowed over the years. Her children were grown and scattered across the country, her husband long gone, their divorce a polite arrangement rather than a bitter affair. She had her books, her garden, and her morning walks, but her days were often more silent than not. It was on a Tuesday, an unremarkable one, that she first saw him. The tall man with dark hair stood in the cereal aisle, scrutinizing the back of a box as if it held the secrets of the universe. Margaret barely noticed him at first, her thoughts preoccupied with whether she'd remembered to add eggs to her list. But when she turned to reach for her preferred muesli, their eyes met. "Excuse me," he said, stepping back to give her space. His voice was warm, casual, and kind, and for reasons she couldn't explain, Margaret felt her cheeks grow warm. "It's fine," she replied, her own voice softer than usual. He smiled, an easy, genuine gesture that creased his face just enough to hint at a boyish charm. "You wouldn't happen to know if this one is any good?" he asked, holding up a box of granola. Margaret glanced at it. "I've tried it. It's a bit sweet for my taste, but not bad." "Good to know." "Thanks," he said, placing it back on the shelf and grabbing another. "What would I do without expert advice?" His playful tone caught her off guard, and before she could stop herself, she smiled back. It was a small moment, trivial in its nature, but something about it lingered with her as she finished her shopping. By the time she reached the checkout counter, she realized she was still smiling. It had been years since she'd noticed someone in this way, and even longer since someone had made her feel noticed in return. For a moment, the air around her felt lighter, less heavy with the quietness she had grown accustomed to. As she pushed her cart back to the car, Margaret chastised herself for the absurdity of her thoughts. He was just a man asking about granola, she reasoned. A stranger she'd likely never see again. And yet, as she started the engine and drove home, she found herself wishing she might the following week. Margaret found herself lingering in the cereal aisle, her heart inexplicably hoping for a repeat encounter. It felt foolish, a schoolgirl's fancy, she told herself. Still, when she spotted him by the bakery section, selecting a baguette with a thoughtful frown, her pulse quickened. "Back for more advice," she teased, surprising even herself. He turned, and that same easy smile spread across his face. "Caught me! I was about to ask which loaf wouldn't turn into a brick by tomorrow." Margaret chuckled. "The sourdough. Trust me." They exchanged a few more light-hearted remarks before he extended his hand. "I'm Liam, by the way." "Margaret," she replied, her palm warm in his firm grip. From then on, their paths seemed to cross frequently. It started with small exchanges about recipes or grocery sales, but soon their conversations deepened. They talked about books and travel, and Margaret learned that Liam was a teacher who had recently moved to town. He spoke of his students with an earnest passion that made her smile. Over time, these chance meetings began to feel less coincidental. Liam would wave to her from across the store, and Margaret found herself looking forward to his warm greetings and playful banter. One afternoon, as they lingered by the dairy section, he said, "You make grocery shopping a lot more enjoyable." The comment caught her off guard, and she glanced at him to see if he was serious. His expression was sincere, without a hint of mockery. "So do you," she admitted quietly, her words a rare confession. As the weeks passed, their exchanges grew into something more deliberate. They began meeting outside the grocery store, grabbing coffee after their shopping trips. Liam had a way of making Margaret laugh, of reminding her how good it felt to share her thoughts and stories with someone who truly listened. For the first time in years, she felt an unmistakable lightness in her life, a joy that she hadn't realized was missing. And though she told herself their bond was simply a friendship, a small, persistent voice whispered that it might be more. It was a rainy Saturday when Margaret's realization hit her with startling clarity. She had spent the afternoon with Liam, sitting by the window of a small cafe they discovered together. The conversation had meandered through familiar topics, his students, her garden, a book he had lent her. But something about the way he laughed at her dry humor, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke, felt different that day. As they stepped outside, Liam opened his umbrella and held it over her head. "Let me walk you to your car," he said, his tone casual but his gesture unassumingly chivalrous. Margaret hesitated but nodded, grateful for the excuse to linger a little longer in his company. As they strolled through the rain-soaked streets, the quiet between them felt warm, not awkward. When they reached her car, Liam paused. "I'm glad we bumped into each other that day," he said, his voice soft. "So am I," Margaret replied, surprised by the lump forming in her throat. He smiled, bid her good night, and walked back toward the cafe. Margaret watched him go, her heart tugging in a way she hadn't felt in decades. As she sat in her car, the truth she had been avoiding rose to the surface. She wasn't just fond of Liam. She had feelings for him. Real, undeniable feelings that went far beyond friendship. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. How could this have happened? She was a woman in her 50s, long past the age of romantic folly. He was younger, vibrant, with a life ahead of him that surely didn't include her. Margaret stared at the raindrops streaking down the windshield, her hands gripping the steering wheel. A mix of emotions surged through her: joy, disbelief, guilt, and fear. She scolded herself for being ridiculous, for letting herself dream of something so improbable. And yet, as she drove home, her mind lingered on the way he had looked at her, the way he had made her feel alive again. It was a feeling she couldn't ignore. No matter how much her rational mind tried to push it away, the days that followed were a whirlwind of emotions for Margaret. She found herself waking up with a sense of anticipation, only to be crushed by the weight of her own doubts. Every glance at her reflection in the mirror felt like an exercise in self-critique. The lines on her face, the gray strands in her hair, were they all he saw? In the quiet hours of the night, Margaret's mind spun with questions. What if she was misreading his kindness? What if he thought of her as nothing more than a mentor or a friend? And even if he did feel something, what would people think? She avoided him for a few days, retreating into the safety of her routines. But the absence of his presence felt unbearable. Her evenings were emptier, her laughter quieter, and the books she had once loved sat untouched on her coffee table. When they finally crossed paths at the grocery store again, Margaret's heart pounded. She had gone there with the intention of seeing him, yet when she spotted him near the produce section, she hesitated. "Margaret!" Liam's voice cut through her uncertainty, his face lighting up as he approached. "I was hoping I'd run into you. You've been scarce lately." She forced a smile, her stomach twisting. "Oh, you know how it is. Life gets busy." But as they talked, her walls began to crumble. Liam had an ease about him, a way of making her feel seen and valued. He told her about a book he thought she'd like, and shared a funny story about one of his students. When he laughed, she couldn't help but join in, the sound bubbling up despite her inner turmoil. For a moment, she let herself forget her fears and simply enjoyed his company. That evening, she sat by her bedroom window, staring out at the moonlit garden below. The feelings she had tried so hard to suppress came rushing back. Liam made her feel alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. But the idea of pursuing something more felt like standing at the edge of a precipice, unsure whether she'd soar or fall. Margaret knew she had a choice to make. She could keep him at arm's length, protecting herself from heartache but living with regret. Or she could take a step forward, risking everything for the chance at something beautiful. Her heart ached with the weight of her decision, but deep down, she knew she couldn't keep living in fear. If nothing else, Liam had shown her that life was too short for what-ifs. The idea crept into her mind slowly, almost imperceptibly. At first, it felt like a fleeting thought, one she could easily dismiss. But with each passing day, the thought took root, growing in her mind like an uninvited guest that couldn't be ignored. It started with a simple text, a message about a book she had mentioned to him during one of their conversations. She didn't expect it to lead to anything more, but as she typed out her words, something in her heart fluttered. She was making a connection with him, and it was more than just words on a screen. Then one afternoon, as she stared at the empty chair across from her kitchen table, Margaret knew it was time. She had always prided herself on her independence, but the loneliness she had felt for so long had become unbearable. She needed something more, something real. She could invite him for tea, maybe a light lunch, nothing too extravagant. Just an invitation to share a quiet moment, to let the connection between them grow in the safe space of her home. She didn't need anything beyond that, or so she told herself. The more she thought about it, the more she convinced herself it was a natural next step. After all, they had already spent hours talking, their conversations weaving together like a tapestry. And yet, when the moment came to send the message, her hand trembled as she typed. "Hi Liam, I was wondering if you'd like to come over for lunch sometime this weekend. Nothing fancy, just a simple meal and a chance to talk." She stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the send button. What if he thought it was too forward? What if he saw it as a gesture of something more than she intended? The doubt crept in, but she pushed it away. She pressed send before she could second-guess herself. The response came a few hours later. "I'd love to, Margaret. I'll bring a bottle of wine. Saturday work for you?" Her heart skipped a beat. He was eager. As the days passed, Margaret found herself preparing with a mix of anticipation and anxiety. She cleaned the house meticulously, arranged fresh flowers on the dining table, and planned a meal that was comforting yet simple. The small details were important. She wanted to create an atmosphere that felt easy, unhurried, just the two of them, in a space where they could be themselves. On Saturday morning, she woke up early, heart racing in her chest. She had the meal prepped and ready, but she couldn't shake the feeling of nervous excitement. What would it be like, having him here in her home? Would their connection deepen? Or would it feel awkward, forced? When the doorbell rang, Margaret's breath caught in her throat. She smoothed her hair, took a deep breath, and opened the door to reveal Liam, standing there with a bottle of wine in his hand and a smile on his face. "Hi," he said, his voice warm and genuine. "I hope I'm not too early." "No, perfect timing," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. The air between them hummed with something unspoken, a subtle tension that neither could deny. Margaret led Liam into the living room, where the soft glow of the afternoon sun filtered through the windows, casting warm, golden light over everything. The quiet was soothing, and yet the presence of another person, especially him, was stirring something she hadn't anticipated. She suddenly realized how long it had been since anyone had shared her space in such an intimate way. "Everything looks wonderful," Liam said, admiring the neatness of the room and the small details she'd put together. The flowers, the carefully arranged table, the subtle elegance that came with the simplicity of the setting. Margaret smiled, feeling a warmth spread across her chest, a feeling that had nothing to do with the dinner she had prepared. It was something more, something real. It was the excitement of having him here, of sharing her world with him, even if just for a few hours. As they sat down to eat, the conversation flowed effortlessly. They spoke of books and music, of childhood memories and far-off places they both hoped to visit. Every word, every glance, felt like a small bridge being built between them. It wasn't about grand gestures or declarations. It was in the quiet, natural way they connected. She found herself laughing more than she had in years, her laughter ringing through the room like a melody. He made her feel lighter, more alive, something she hadn't realized she had lost over the years. He wasn't just someone to talk to. He was someone who made her feel seen, understood. They shared a bottle of wine, its rich, velvety taste adding to the intimate atmosphere between them. The evening wore on slowly, with no rush to go anywhere, to do anything. It was just the two of them, enjoying each other's company in a way that felt both effortless and profound. After dinner, they moved to the living room, where they settled on the couch. Margaret noticed how close they had become without either of them acknowledging it. There was a subtle energy in the air, something undeniable. He was no longer just the young man from the grocery store. He was Liam, someone who had become a part of her world in ways she hadn't expected. "You know," Liam said, his voice soft but steady, "I've really enjoyed today. It feels like I've known you a lot longer than I have." Margaret met his gaze, her heart fluttering. It was exactly how she felt, though she hadn't yet found the words to express it. There was something about him that made her feel like they were destined to cross paths, that this wasn't just a fleeting connection, but something deeper, something meaningful. "I've enjoyed it too," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's been a long time since I've had company like this. I didn't expect it, but I'm glad." Their eyes locked for a long moment, and in that silence, something unspoken passed between them. A shared understanding, a mutual acknowledgement of the bond that had begun to form. Liam shifted slightly, leaning in a little closer. Margaret's breath caught in her throat, her pulse quickening. She felt a warmth spread through her, something familiar yet new, something that felt almost like longing, but it was more than that. It was a sense of rightness, of inevitability. He reached out and gently touched her hand, his fingers warm against her skin. The simple touch sent a wave of electricity through her, making her heart race. She looked at him, searching his eyes for something. Perhaps reassurance, perhaps an answer to the question she hadn't yet voiced aloud. "I didn't think it would be like this," she murmured, her voice trembling just slightly. "Like what?" Liam asked, his voice low, but there was an understanding there. An unspoken knowledge that they were standing on the edge of something important. She took a deep breath, then let it out slowly. "I didn't expect to feel this way. Not at my age. Not with you." Liam's expression softened, and he squeezed her hand gently. "I didn't expect it either, but I'm glad it's happening." In that moment, Margaret realized that she wasn't alone anymore, not in the way she had always feared. She had let someone in, and in doing so, had allowed herself to embrace a connection that was deeper than she had ever imagined. She wasn't just a woman in her 50s. She was someone deserving of love, of companionship, of joy, no matter the age, no matter the circumstances. The silence between them deepened, but it was no longer filled with uncertainty. It was filled with the understanding that what they shared in that moment was real, and it was something worth exploring. Later that evening, after Liam had left, his warmth still lingering in the air, Margaret sat in her favorite armchair by the window, staring out into the darkening sky. The quiet was different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was filled with thoughts, with feelings she hadn't known she was capable of having at this stage in her life. She thought back on the day, on the way her heart had fluttered when their hands touched, on the conversations that had flowed so easily. She had laughed, truly laughed, for the first time in years, without the weight of hesitation, without wondering what others would think. It was strange, the way life had unfolded for her. She had spent so many years in the background, quietly observing others live their lives. She had built walls to protect herself, convinced that love was a young person's game, that the chance for passion and excitement had passed her by. But here she was, in the midst of something that defied all logic, all expectations. Margaret had always prided herself on being rational, on understanding the world in terms of what was possible, of what made sense. But what she felt for Liam didn't make sense. He was younger than her by nearly 2 decades, and in a world that often judged women for loving across such a divide, she knew that their connection wouldn't be understood by everyone. But in her heart, in the quiet spaces where her true feelings resided, she understood. Love had no rules. It didn't care about age or expectations. It was simply something that happened, something that needed no justification. As she sat there, she felt the weight of societal judgment creeping in, the whispers, the sideways glances that would surely come if anyone knew what was happening between them. There were risks, and the fear of those risks had often held her back from pursuing what she wanted. But tonight she felt different. She felt as though, in some way, she had reclaimed a part of herself she had long forgotten. She wasn't just an older woman. She was someone who could still feel excitement, still long for connection, still yearn for love, and she could embrace that without shame. Margaret realized that her hesitation had nothing to do with age. It was about the fear of vulnerability, of opening up to someone again, of allowing herself to be seen. She had built so many walls over the years, walls that kept her safe, yes, but also kept her from truly living. But Liam had changed something in her. He had made her feel alive again, and for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid to embrace the possibility of what might come next. She didn't need permission. She didn't need validation from anyone else. All she needed was to follow her heart, wherever it led. And in that moment, Margaret made a promise to herself. She would no longer let the judgments of others define her worth or limit her possibilities. She would not let her age become an obstacle. Love, real, pure, and full of possibilities, was something she had every right to experience, no matter how old she was. The world may not understand it. People may talk, they may question. But Margaret was no longer concerned with what they thought. She was concerned with what she felt, and that feeling was undeniable. She smiled to herself, a soft, content smile. Love wasn't defined by age. It was simply something that happened, and it had happened to her. Now, the question wasn't whether or not she was worthy of it. It was whether she was brave enough to see where it could take her.